Thank you for the very kind introduction. I want to begin by thanking the Center for International and Regional Studies for inviting us here, for Moran for that very kind introduction, the staff for doing all the logistical arrangements so effectively, and of course all of you for coming out. Our topic today is Middle East policy, as you know, and the role of the Israel lobby. And I want to begin by saying just a few words about why this is a subject that needs to be handled with some care. Any discussion of this issue takes place in the shadow of centuries of anti-Semitism, most of it in Europe, and one part of that history of anti-Semitism are various conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which depict some kind of secret Jewish conspiracy to control the world or to take over countries, to control their foreign policy. And I want to make it clear at the outset that John and I reject every one of those various anti-Semitic conspiracy ideas. For us, the Israel lobby is not a cabal or a conspiracy, and certainly not some kind of plot to control American foreign policy or dominate the Middle East. The Israel lobby is an interest group, like lots of other interest groups in the United States, and its activities are normal forms of democratic politics in America. The question we're interested in is whether the policies that these groups have advocated in the United States are in the American national interest, in the interest of other countries in the Middle East, or indeed in Israel's interest itself. And as we'll lay out in the next few minutes, our answer to that question is no, that in fact the key organizations in the lobby have been encouraging policies that have been bad for the United States, bad for other countries in the region, and bad for Israel as well. I might add that John and I do not question Israel's legitimacy or its right to exist. In fact, we believe the United States should come to its aid if its survival is ever in jeopardy. But we also think that the activities of the lobby and their influence on American policy are subjects that Americans, and indeed everyone, ought to be able to talk about openly, that reasonable people ought to be able to discuss the same way we would discuss any other groups that try to influence American policy or any other aspect of U.S. foreign relations. And of course, we wrote the original article and our subsequent book to try and encourage that sort of discussion. So let me say a few words about the special relationship between the United States and Israel, and then talk about the lobby and how it works. Yitzhak Rabin once said that American support for Israel was beyond compare in modern history, and he was right. It's the largest recipient of U.S. economic and military aid, and it gets this aid even when it does things that the United States formally opposes, like building settlements in the occupied territories. Israel gets consistent diplomatic support from the United States, and it's rarely, if ever, criticized by American politicians, and certainly not by anyone who's running for high office in the United States. All you have to do is look at the current presidential campaign, where all the major candidates have been competing with each other to demonstrate that they, in fact, are Israel's best friend. Now, the question is why? Why do they do this, and why does the United States have this special relationship? Well, there are three answers you usually hear in the United States. The first answer is that Israel is a vital strategic asset for the United States. That may have been true during the Cold War, but the Cold War is now over. Today, it's hard to argue that giving Israel unconditional support is making the United States more popular around the world or making American citizens safer back at home. On balance, the special relationship is now a strategic liability for the United States. The second argument is that Israel is a democracy that shares American values. Yes, it's a vibrant democracy, but so are many other countries around the world, and none of them have the same kind of special relationship. None of them get so much help with so few strings attached. Plus, Israeli democracy and American democracy are not identical. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. Non-Jews are treated as second-class citizens there. By contrast, the United States is a liberal democracy, where citizens of any race or religion are supposed to have equal rights. We don't say the United States is an Anglo-Saxon state. We don't say the United States is a Christian state. plus Israel's treatment of its Arab citizens, and especially its Palestinian subjects, is sharply at odds with U.S. values. So, yes, Israel's a democracy, but its values and our values are not identical. Nor is Israel's behavior significantly better than that of the Palestinians. Without going into the details here, it seems to me any reasonably fair-minded look at the history of this conflict shows that both sides have done many cruel things to each other, and neither side owns the moral high ground here. So you can't explain the special relationship by pointing to just shared democracy, shared values, or the argument that Israel's behavior is somehow better than everyone else's is. A third argument, finally, is that the American people are strongly pro-Israel, and that explains the special relationship, that politicians are just doing what the American people want. But again, if you look closely at that one, it's not very convincing either. Although Americans do have a favorable image of Israel, they are not demanding that politicians back it no matter what it does. For example, a survey conducted by the Anti-Defamation League in 2005 found that 78% of Americans think the United States should favor neither side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A poll in 2003 by the University of Maryland found that over 70% of politically active Americans favored cutting aid to Israel if it refused to settle the conflict. So again, Americans do have a favorable image of Israel, but they are not insisting that politicians back it unconditionally. So what explains the special relationship? In our view, it's primarily the political influence of the lobby. The Israel lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that works actively and openly in American politics to push that special relationship. In the United States, interest groups are at the center of how our political process works, and that's been true ever since the country was founded. In the United States, any group that wants to can form an organization on any issue it cares about and then try to convince politicians to do what they want. So interest groups in the United States include teachers, lawyers, people who want gun control and people who oppose gun control, corporations, farmers, and these groups can do lots of different things. They can give money to candidates who are running for office. They can get people to send letters to politicians telling them how to vote. They can hire people to write books and articles supporting their point of view, and they can certainly try to get people who are sympathetic to their views elected to office or appointed to key positions. And of course, these groups will always try to make sure that newspapers, radio, and television communicate information that helps them make their case. And the point I want to emphasize is this is completely normal behavior in American politics. It's how the American political system operates. Finally, as most of you know, some interest groups in the United States reflect national origins because we're a country that has drawn its population from all over the world, and people don't lose that attachment to some foreign country once they get to the United States. So Irish Americans have worked to shape U.S. policy towards Ireland. Indian Americans are very active now trying to promote close ties between the United States and India. And again, this is completely normal and legitimate behavior in the American political system. So what's the Israel lobby, and how does it work? Well, I'm thinking here of organizations like AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, Christian Zionist groups like Christians United for Israel, think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, publications like the Weekly Standard or the New Republic that take a consistently pro-Israel line. Now, that tells you something about interest groups in the United States. They are often involve many different components that are doing somewhat different things. And the Israel lobby is like these other groups, like, say, the environmental movement, that has lots of different parts and lots of different components. To emphasize just a few more things about the lobby, it's not a centralized organization, and the various groups that make up the Israel lobby do not agree on every single issue. For example, some of these groups are strongly in favor of a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. Other groups are adamantly opposed to a two-state solution. What they have in common is that they all support the special relationship, and they want the United States to continue to back Israel regardless of what Israel's policies are. Of course, it's certainly not a cabal or conspiracy. Again, it's just an interest group that operates the same way many others do. Final point about the lobby, it's not synonymous with Jewish Americans. Surveys suggest that about 25 to 30% of Jewish Americans don't care very much about Israel one way or the other. Many other American Jews do not support the positions advocated by the most important groups in the lobby, and some of the groups that work to promote the special relationship, such as the so-called Christian Zionists, aren't Jewish. So the lobby is defined by its political agenda, that special relationship, not by ethnicity and not by religion. So how does it work? Well, as I've already suggested, in the United States, interest groups can do lots of different things, and even small groups that care a lot about a single issue can often wield disproportionate influence, because politicians can win their support by doing what these small groups want without necessarily losing anybody else's. And like other interest groups, the Israel lobby works in two main ways. First, it works to get sympathetic people elected to office or appointed to key positions in the government, and once they're there, it tries to give them clear incentives to follow the policies the lobby supports. To take AIPAC for a moment, AIPAC is an organization with an annual budget of about $50 million. It's very active, especially on Capitol Hill, helping congressmen draft legislation, providing them with lots of information about Middle East affairs that reflects a pro-Israel point of view, providing them with talking points. It's highly professional, very effective, with a very energetic grassroots base. AIPAC, despite its name, is not a PAC. It's not a political action committee. In America, a PAC, or political action committee, is a fundraising organization that raises money to give to candidates for office. What AIPAC does is it solicits from each candidate for Congress a memo explaining what that person's views on the Middle East are. And then AIPAC gives its approval to the various political action committees that do exist, indicating which ones ought to get their support and which people ought to get opposed. And over the last 15 years or so, pro-Israel political action committees have given about $55 million to different people running for office once they got the green light from organizations like AIPAC. By comparison, Arab American political action committees gave about $800,000 over the same period. So it's $55 million on one side, $800,000 on the other, and you start to get an idea of why politicians are sensitive to what AIPAC thinks of them. The point is that anyone running for office in the United States, and certainly anyone running for president, understands that to be even remotely critical of Israel is going to make it a lot harder to get elected. And that is why Stephen Rosen, the former AIPAC official who's now under indictment for passing classified information to Israel, once put a napkin in front of a journalist from The New Yorker and said, in 24 hours, we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin. Bill Clinton said AIPAC was better than anybody else lobbying in Washington, and Newt Gingrich called it the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said, there's no group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. And former Senator Fritz Hollings said upon his retirement from the Senate, you can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. And that is why Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said in 2006, thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world. And again, it's not just AIPAC, but it's also a number of other groups and individuals, including a subset of the Christian evangelical movement in the United States. So that's one strategy, playing the political game the way other groups do, but playing it very effectively. The second strategy is to try and shape public discourse in the United States so that Israel is viewed favorably by most Americans and so that people don't hear very much criticism of Israel. Mainstream media in the United States tends to be very pro-Israel, especially in its editorial commentary and in terms of op-ed columnists and pundits. If you compare commentary in the United States with either Europe or commentary in Israel itself, there's simply a much narrower range of views expressed in the American mainstream media. For example, if you look at columnists in major papers in the United States, there is simply no equivalent of Akiva Elder, Bradley Burston, Gideon Levy, or Amira Haas, all of whom write for Haaretz in Israel, and all of whom are often very critical of Israeli policy. My point is not that they are always right and that pro-Israel commentators are always wrong. My point is that voices like theirs are largely absent from mainstream media in the United States. But even so, some groups in the lobby monitor media coverage and organize boycotts and demonstrations against any news agencies that broadcast or publish anything critical of Israel. So to give you just two examples, when Jimmy Carter published his book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, groups in the lobby took out ads in major newspapers which included the publisher's phone number and invited readers to call the publisher and complain about the publication of Carter's book. Similarly, in the fall of 2007, CNN broadcast a three-part series comparing Christian, Muslim, and Jewish fundamentalism. And the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations urged its members to take up the issue of that broadcast with any companies that had bought advertising time on CNN to help pay for it. The purpose here, of course, is to remind CNN not to do that again because it might have consequences for CNN's profits. Now, these efforts are not 100% successful, which means you do see some books, articles, and TV and radio programs that are critical of Israeli policy or critical of the special relationship. So it is not the case that the Israel lobby controls the media in the United States. But on balance, media coverage is heavily slanted in Israel's favor, and critical voices face an uphill battle to be heard. Finally, as most of you know, efforts to stifle criticism often include smearing critics by accusing them of being anti-Semitic. Martin Peretz, the editor of The New Republic, wrote that President Carter will, quote, go down in history as a Jew hater. Another pro-Israel newspaper wrote that Carter was sympathetic to Nazi-era war criminals. Similarly, when the nonpartisan, highly respected human rights group Human Rights Watch issued a report on Israel's behavior during the summer 2006 war in Lebanon, pointing out where Israel had violated the laws of war, its director, Kenneth Roth, was repeatedly smeared with the charge of being an anti-Semite, even though Roth is in fact Jewish and his father was a refugee from Nazi Germany. It's worth noting, by the way, that Human Rights Watch also condemned Hezbollah for its own violations of the laws of war. And as you might expect, accusations of anti-Semitism have been a common charge leveled at John and myself, even though there is not the slightest shred of evidence to support it. Of course, people are smeared in this way for several different reasons. First of all, it distracts people from the real issue, which is American policy. Second, it's meant to deter people from raising any critical voices, because who wants to be labeled with a loathsome charge like anti-Semitism? And finally, it seeks to discourage or marginalize people within the public arena, because after all, what politician would want to associate with anyone who'd been accused of being an anti-Semite, even if the charge is absurd and there's no basis for it? The bottom line, of course, is that there's very little serious debate about the U.S.-Israeli relationship or the activities of the lobby, even at a moment in time when it's obvious to virtually everyone that American Middle East policy has gone badly off track. And of course, you haven't seen much discussion of our broad Middle East policy during the current presidential campaign. One final point. The lobby's influence would not be a problem if the policies it was advocating made sense. It, in fact, would not be a problem at all to have a powerful Israel lobby if the policies it was trying to push were good for the United States, good for Israel, and good for other countries in the Middle East. So the real question is, are the policies that the lobby has been promoting for many years in the American national interest, or in the interests of our other friends in the region, or even, in fact, in Israel's interest as well? And as John will now explain, we think the answer to those questions is no. Thank you very much.